Welcome everyone to the valedictory session of the Today International Conference. We'll be commencing the valedictory session. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce the speaker and chair for this session. The chair for the valedictory session is Professor Tridib Chakraborti. Dr. Tridib Chakraborti was a professor and former head of the Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University. He is an expert of Southeast Asian and Asia Pacific affairs, Indian political thought, and foreign policy and strategic studies. He has written more than 57 book chapters published in various edited volumes on different topics related to Southeast and South Asia, Indian political thought, and foreign policy. In 2015, he has been selected as a visiting professor of ICCR chair at Dublin City University, Dublin, Ireland. He was a former professor and dean, School of Social Sciences, Adamas University, Barasat, West Bengal, and currently joined as an emeritus professor, School of Liberal Arts and Cultural Studies at the same university. Thank you very much, sir, for being here in this conference among us. The speaker for this session is Professor Baladas Ghoshal. Professor Baladas Ghoshal is a former professor of Southeast Asia and Southwest Pacific Studies and chairman of the Center for South and Southeast Asian Studies at JNU, New Delhi. Professor Ghoshal is currently the Secretary General and Director, Academic Society for Indian Ocean Studies. Professor Ghoshal is the ICCR Chair in Indian Studies at Russian State University for Humanities, Moscow. He is also the Honorary Distinguished Fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. Professor Ghoshal has published extensively on Indonesian politics, ASEAN, and regional security issues. Thank you very much, sir, for blessing the occasion with your presence. I pass over the microphone to Chairperson, sir, for the further proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Okay. So I think it's my honor to chair as a session of a renowned professor, a don in our area, especially in Southeast Asia, and who happens to be my teacher, most respected teacher. So it's really honor, and I'm really privileged to act as a chairing the session. So I should not say anything more. So I request my respected professor, Professor Ghoshal, to please deliver his valedictory speech.
So I can start.
Yes, sir. You can start.
Okay. I think it's both a pleasure and a privilege to be able to deliver the valedictory address in this August gathering of scholars from different parts of India and who have been deliberating for the last 2 days on a very critical area of our foreign policy, our relations with Sri Lanka and Maldives, the two island nations who have maritime boundaries with India. I'm sure all the participants as well as the panelists must have talked threadbare the various issues that affect the relationship between India and the two island states. And they have also provided many ideas or feast of ideas that you can easily try to deliberate on. Now, what I will do, because I don't have exactly what you have already talked about, but I'm sure you have done it quite threadbare. Now, what I would do, I would try to emphasize on certain areas of relationship that impinges on India's foreign policy. Now, before that, I think I will make a few general statements. The first statement that I'll make is that foreign policies are always a function of both domestic and external factors and cannot be separated from the regional, strategic, economic, and political environment. They are all interlinked with each other, and separation of these three factors could not give us a proper perspective of India's interaction with this region. Now, this brings me to another interesting point about South Asia in general, I think, which affects India's relationship with not only Sri Lanka and Maldives, but also with other South Asian countries. India is unique in many respects. This particular region is also unique in that sense that all the countries of South Asia have common borders with India, either maritime or land borders with India. But interestingly, none of the other countries have any common border with each other. That makes the relationship a very peculiar kind of relationship, that all the countries' major focus had been India-centric. And more importantly, India's economy, India's size, military strength is much more. I think combined all the other countries, it would be the size of India. So that makes the direction of foreign policies of the countries of South Asia towards India. And sometimes they hedge vis-a-vis India by aligning themselves with other countries that have interest in the region, or sometimes there are also charges of ganging up against India. So I think this factor is also important, and that relates to the first point that I tried to make, is that domestic external factors are interrelated in South Asia. And in fact, none of the issues are domestic in nature alone. In fact, they are also, all domestic issues are foreign policy issues, and foreign policy issues are domestic issues. They're intermeshing with each other. The classic example, of course, in the case of Sri Lanka is that we have Tamils in India, and Sri Lanka also has its Tamils in their eastern and northern parts. So obviously, domestic factors impinge in the relationship, and that is exemplified in the recent development where India abstained from a vote in the United Nations regarding human rights behavior of Sri Lanka, where the Tamil community in India were extremely dissatisfied with the whole sort of India's attitude, that India abstained from it. They wanted that strong measures, condemnation should be made in regard to the human rights record of Sri Lanka. But India has its own, strategic reasons not to get involved in this kind of things, and they decided to abstain from it. Another important factor is, in South Asia particularly, is that one can be ideological in terms of one's orientation, but that has its own costs. People like many critics in India would like to say that our policy towards Myanmar, where we have not condemned the military coup, while we mentioned that democracy is the most favorite thing that the Myanmar military should again try to restore, and they should release all the democratic leaders that have been either house arrested or any other actions that military has taken against them. But we have not really condemned the military coup, essentially because that, again, I would say that only countries with sufficient access to both economic and military power can afford to be ideologically oriented in their foreign policy orientation. A major power, even if it criticizes a smaller country on human rights issues, there may be a temporary setback in the relationship, but ultimately, because of the enormous amount of asymmetry in power relationships, they sometimes come back to the same major power. America or even China, to a large extent, can afford to be critical of a certain country. But in the case of India, although India's size is much larger, but India doesn't have that kind of resources to be able to antagonize any of our smaller neighbors. With the result, India has to be extremely cautious in terms of the developments that are taking place in these countries. The third point that I would like to proposition is that there is a tendency amongst the critics of India's foreign policy or in any analysis of international relations. They try to treat all interactions in terms of zero-sum game, that one's gain is others' loss. Now, this may not be the fact. One's gain may not lead to automatically the loss of others. There are, of course, in relationship, there are flows of, ebbs and flows in the relationship. Sometimes the relationships are good, sometimes the relationships are bad. But that should not be treated as something that, it's a loss for a particular country. Now, any gain that China makes in South Asia, in terms of its forays into South Asia, its Belt and Road Initiative, its attempt to have access to the sources, attempt to have access to the Indian Ocean, all are treated by many of our foreign policy critics as something that India's loss and China's gain. I don't particularly accept this particular view. There may be a temporary gain of a particular country, but that is not a long-lasting gain. Yes, the resources, ability on their part to provide economic succor to some of these countries do make some difference. China obviously 4 or 5 times more than India's economy, and its checkbook diplomacy is quite active in most of these countries. Yet, the checkbook diplomacy sometimes do not work. It may even go against it on some occasions or other. So, any development that might look to be something affecting India's national interests or India's economic interests in the countries of this region should not be treated as something that India has lost and others have gained. And this point, I think, needs to be highlighted very effectively because, if you look at the attitude of most of the countries like, say, Nepal, Bangladesh, all the other smaller countries in the region, you will see that even if they lean towards China, they at least assure India that we are not taking advantage of a particular situation and trying to go against India. Like Sri Lanka has repeatedly mentioned that India is a neighbor, is a family, almost a relation, whereas China is a friend. Because of the historical links, cultural links, economic links in the past, it is practically impossible for any of the South Asian countries to detach completely from India. And that's why you'll see that from time to time, say for example, India's relations with Bangladesh will suffer some strains on certain issues, but then again it will come back to a certain normalcy. And in certain areas, India would be much more closer to those countries. Take the example of even Nepal in recent years, which has been trying to flex its muscles a little bit with, drunk with the kind of support that they've got from China in terms of economic Belt and Road Initiative, loans, credits, and various other things. Yet they have to really come towards India also to settle some of their issues. And so this particular factor has to be kept in mind in order to evaluate our relationship with Sri Lanka and Maldives. The fourth proposition that I'll make, that there is a difference between China's influence and India's influence in these countries. And there is also a difference in India's and China's strategies that they adopt towards these countries. Whereas in the case of China, the basic objective is to lure these countries to their bloc by assuring them economic benefits. But those economic benefits sometimes don't help the recipient countries. They're basically meant to strengthen China's economic viability and China's economic strength vis-à-vis those countries. And they're also tied up with strategic necessities and strategic advantages. Economic offensive and strategic offensive on the part of China go hand to hand, and they're interrelated. There's always geoeconomic advantages, and those are also related to geopolitical and geostrategic advantages on the part of China. The second aspect of China's, help, economic loans, grants, all are related to areas that indirectly affect China's own economic position. Either it wants to use its excess capacity, excess economic capacity, like the use of steel and various other materials in terms of construction and projects in other countries. So those are related to China's own advantage. Whereas in the case of India, India's help, loan, and various other kinds of economic transactions or interactions in these countries are basically collaborative, consultative, and based on the local needs, not on what India gains. Now, India may gain strategically from some of those measures, but basically those are given essentially to build the capacities on the part of the recipient countries. Now, this difference sometimes, makes a country, the recipient country, they may be quite sort of happy with receiving a lot of, economic succor from China, but they also understand that this may lead to sometimes debt trap and other kinds of disadvantages. So you will see from time to time, they also cancel some of the projects that they had undertaken. One example is the housing, the projects that were initially given to the Chinese, and the local people objected to it because they wanted their houses to be brick construction, not concrete construction. So ultimately those were cancelled and given to India, and India has built about 46,000 houses in the areas where the Tamils were affected and became homeless. And other kinds of help also India provides, basically directed towards building the capacities like health, education, helping the industrial capacities, the small scale and middle scale entrepreneurs. All these are built into India's, high-tech program, and those are translated in most of these countries in terms of building capacities for these countries. So I think one has to also make a difference in terms of the kind of relationship that we have with some of the countries in the region and the relationship that China wants to build. I think everybody talks about Sri Lanka cancelling in February that Eastern Terminal project that was given to India and Japan. And everybody feels that there's a Chinese hand in it because China didn't want the Colombo port to be developed because that would affect the Hambantota port, where they've invested very heavily. Now, eventually, of course, Sri Lanka wanted to give an alternative thing to India, because India's displeasure in Japan, they didn't want to antagonize either of these. So I think these are all temporary kind of things that might affect. But eventually, of course, one has to also admit the fact that China has much greater capability in terms of supporting these countries. And you cannot blame the smaller countries because after all, they lack resources, they lack capital, and they would obviously go towards a country that can provide better health, better facilities, better advantages. Bangladesh has been able to establish itself as a developmental state, essentially with support from China. In the process, of course, that might have affected the democratic process in the country, but at least Bangladesh has emerged as a developmental state, like the states of Southeast Asia, that happened in the 80s and 90s. And today, Bangladesh has graduated itself into a developing country, not anymore the basket case. Now, India doesn't have that kind of resources. Even in the case of maritime cooperation in the Indian Ocean, where India is a resident state, resident power in the Indian Ocean, yet even there, India doesn't have the capabilities to sustain its role in the region. The budget that is approved for the Indian Navy is almost peanuts compared to what the Chinese have budgets for their own development of their Navy and development of the military capabilities. So this difference also has to be kept in mind in terms of assessing and analyzing India's position in the region. Now, what India has been doing in the absence of those capabilities is
Sir, you have been muted. Sir, you have been muted.
Please unmute yourself.
You have been muted. Sir, you have been muted. শোনা যাচ্ছে না।
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Yes, sir. Yes.
মাইক্রোফোনটা মাঝে মাঝে মিউট হয়ে যায়।
Okay. I think there's some technical problem. So the point that I was trying to drive at is that there is an asymmetrical relationship in terms of the capabilities between India and China. And obviously that would impinge our relationship with the region. And the smaller countries cannot also be blamed because after all, they need resources, they need capital, and whichever country would offer them at a much more favorable terms will automatically be received by those countries. And in fact, China has been spending enormous amount of money in terms of its Belt and Road Initiative. And that those countries where they have these projects, they have also benefited because India cannot offer the same kind of development assistance as China can. So obviously there will be a gap in that. But I think another problem with India, which also creates some kind of a problem in terms of our relationship with these countries, is the delivery deficit. That we undertake projects, we promise them quite a lot, but then in terms of implementation, that doesn't happen all the time. This typical Indian bureaucracy, India's slow-moving thing. Democracy is another factor, that decision-making becomes much more difficult in terms of, and particularly in India's raucous democracy, where people shout more than they act. So in such a situation, sometimes decision becomes very difficult, and bureaucratic control also becomes very difficult. With the result, many of the projects that we have promised in some of these countries have not been implemented properly. Compared to India, China has been able to, in fact, complete their projects even before the scheduled time. So obviously, that makes a difference in terms of the approaches of the two countries and the way the recipient countries benefit. The other kinds of problems also in India, there are labor issues, procurement of land, and all those things. The Vietnamese labor works almost 10 hours a day, whereas an Indian labor, it works only 8 hours. And out of the 8 hours, maybe 4 hours, maybe just gossiping. So that obviously has impact on the productive capacity. Vietnamese labor's productive capacity is 4 times that in Indian labor. So obviously, anything India's products are not, competitive in these countries. And China obviously has an advantage over India. So all these factors taken together, working within these constraints and keeping in mind that India's governance system is basically fire brigade governance, that there are no plans in advance. Every minute, every hour, India has to, all Indian governments have to firefight. Now, keeping that in mind, I think India policy towards this region have to be brought within those perimeters. And only then one can understand how India can respond to some of the situations. So altogether, to my mind, there's no point in elaborating on these issues and repeating what other participants and panelists have already mentioned. I would say that with little bit of calibration, better delivery capacity, better understanding of the local sensibilities will enable India to correct some of the things that has put India under difficult situations in this region. And I'm sure those countries will also realize, although in their public discourses they might call India a big brother, but they realize that India is actually an elder brother who has been always willing to support some of these smaller countries in their times of distress and difficulties. So little calibration, little understanding of the local sensibilities will allow us to have a better perspective of our interactions with these countries, and will be able to overcome some of the problems that we are encountering at this moment. I think I'll stop at this stage, and if anybody wants to put any questions to me, I'm prepared to elaborate on some of the points that I have already mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. At least we are really enriched with your fantastic deliberation. So I can request anybody have any question to our respected professor, you can ask. Kindly introduce yourself and please ask any question. If you
Yeah, I
can.
wanted to ask something. Can I ask?
Yes, yes, you can.
I'm Professor Padmini Balram from Vishwabharati. I wanted to know, it was a very nice lecture, and I just wanted to know how India, I mean, like China is helping so many, I mean, they're more rich and they can afford to help in certain way, in much more monetary wise, and they're also fast and very disciplined. And now there are two factors to this because China is very disciplined because there are so many rules in China that if you don't do certain things, you will be jailed and killed. With democracy in India, that never happens. So it's something like a you frighten the people to the extent to behave in certain manner. Because I've seen in China, even the housings and the roads broadening. I mean, I was there for within 3 months. This removed all the houses aside, and I asked them that what happens to these people who are staying there. So they will just go into the slums. Can that happen in India? And would we like that kind of military regime? I mean, we may also, if we have that kind of regime, and then tomorrow somebody comes and breaks your house and says, I want to make the road, and I don't give you much compensation, you become a slum dweller. Would that be the kind of situation we would want in our country? And would we like to do that kind of a thing? I mean, there are many things attached to these prosperity. There are many things attached to these kind of things. Also, similarly, they are using that strategy. They will soon use it to the neighboring countries of ours. So they should also understand that these are the kind of things that, okay, the fastness comes, they're very efficient, because they are very efficient, because many of them were kind of taken as hostages and made them work in China. And I've seen many of these things. So, I mean, I don't know whether we should be comparing that way because it is impossible to even think of it in India.
Is that your question?
Yeah, so what am I trying to say is how will these people who are kind of today taking help from China do not end up being one of their, like what they are treating people in China today, they could start doing it in these countries as well once they overpower the, with their money, once they overpower them. That is a possibility.
Yes, I can understand your sort of point of view and the question as well. Now, I think there are two extremes. China's is also an extreme that it is an authoritarian society and it imposes things on people and they want whatever their objectives, they want to achieve those objectives with whatever means that possible. There is no relationship between means and ends. For them, end is more important than means. Now, in the case of India, also is another extreme that, there are so many restraints and constraints in terms of our behavior. For example, take the example at this moment that India is really under stress, both economically, politically, and strategically. So India has no other option but to fall back on building relationship with countries who are able to at least support India's goals and objectives. And that's why India develops relationship with United States, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and many of those countries, middle-level countries in Southeast Asia. Now, if you look at the debates in this country, you will see that some of those signs of non-alignment is still evident in many of the presentations in our country. That we are falling into the lap of United States, and United States is going to take us for a ride, and all that kind of thing. We have to use our foreign policy autonomy and all that kind of stuff. Now, do you have really any autonomy in terms of foreign policy making? A country that imports 70% of its military requirements from foreign sources, can it have any autonomy for that matter? China doesn't do so. So, you have to take into account all these factors as well. But our democracy in the debates sometimes lead to a situation where it cancels out each other. No actions can be undertaken. Like a Japanese friend once told me that you Indians are so brilliant that you cancel out each other. No actions, only debates. So I think one has to also take into account those things, that there is a need for a consensus on certain issues, particularly on the question of national security and our national interests. But in India, it becomes extremely difficult to achieve that kind of consensus. No democracy can. But you see, in a country like United States, which is a democracy, or in any other democratic countries in the West, you will see that at least on certain foreign policy issues, there is a bipartisan or multi-partisan consensus on certain issues. But in the case of India, there is none. One political party which pursues a particular stand at a certain period of time will change that stand when it is in opposition. And its position will be quite different when it is in power. So in such a situation, it becomes very difficult to pursue any coherent strategy towards in country. So there is a need also for certain discipline in our country. I'm not suggesting that it should lead to authoritarian models and all that, but one should also have or build certain consensus.
Sir,
Take the example of this recent labor laws. People who have been criticizing the labor laws have not read it. And that's why they have been asking for all kinds of things. Some of the people who are agitating, they're multimillionaires, driving Mercedes, and they still want MSP. So I think, I remember Mr. Shahabuddin, who was a diplomat at one time. Later on, he joined politics, led the foreign service, and became a great sort of promoter of that Babri Mosque thing. He was a great promoter of banning of that, what is his name, that author, that Muslim, I'm forgetting his name right at this moment. That book was banned in India. I knew Shahabuddin. In fact, I asked him one day, have you read the book? He said, why should I read the book? I know it is anti-Islam, so I don't need to read the book. So I think the attitude in this country also, that anything any government does, I'm not suggesting this government or that government, our essential approach is to oppose anything that the existing government does. We might have done the same thing in the past, but that doesn't matter. So there is a certain element of discipline also in our thinking process, and as well as in their approaches towards many of the issues. It's a dog in the manger policy, doesn't help. If I'm not benefited, I shouldn't allow others to also benefit. It's self-destructive kind of policies. And Indians sometimes shoot in their own foot.
Yeah, sir, what happens is actually many times this has now gone out of India because of our new systems and the education that we went into with all these. Okay, we have now education which is very concerned about marks. We are having education which is very concerned about going ahead. I mean, competitive kind of education system, but the value system is going. And once the value system goes, it is very difficult because these are the children who have not got the values, who grow up with competing with each other and pulling down each other. Once the value system is there, because this is what is happening in the education in East Asia. I mean, there is so much value system taught in Japan, in South Korea, and all these countries in the school itself. There are even classes such as like you have to groom your own classroom. So these kind of things have gone from India, which was so much there. And that's the reason we are having these things that even I'm sometimes so surprised when I say, oh, you are, when I tell my students, why don't you make best of it? You are hardly paying any money at Central University. Like our fees are only 1,250 rupees per semester. So I said that doesn't even cover the electricity bill. So why don't you make best of it and come and join the classes regularly, do work regularly? I was shocked to get an answer saying that, well, ours is a central university, so it's duty of government to do that. So what is your duty? To bunk and manage the scholarship, which is more than the what you are paying. A OBC person or 60 person will get a scholarship something like 45,000 rupees, and he pays 5,000 rupees. I mean 2,500 rupees. Sorry, exactly. Yeah, 2,500 rupees per year. So
you know, I think my answer would be in 2 sentences. I was a student of Jadavpur University in the late 50s and early 60s. And we paid 20 rupees per month in 9 installments, which comes to 180 rupees a year for our entire fees.
Yeah.
And I think 60 years after, I don't think anything has changed in Jadavpur in terms of the fees. Maybe a little rise.
Little rise.
You can't run an education. You can't run an educational system like this. And
yeah.
see what happens in such freebies is that you don't take education seriously.
Absolutely, that's exactly what I say.
If you have to shell out from your pocket, then you will take education seriously. I have taught in Jadavpur 20 years and also many universities in the world. People might find this a little bit harsh that I've seen, postgraduate classes. I lecture and it goes over the heads of the students. 1 or 2 students listen to them and the rest sleep over it. Essentially because cheap education. If they had to shell out the money, they would have extracted things also from the professor. Now, I think education up to school level should be completely free.
Absolutely.
But university education, particularly higher education, should be paid by the students. And there should be provisions for loans and other things from the banks and various other agencies. Nothing should come free. Free meal is a good thing. Then you don't take it seriously. You look at the education system in private universities, like Ashoka, Zindal, they pay through their nose and they also take it very seriously. So anyway, I think that is not the real thrust of our lecture or discussions today, but I'd be happy if somebody else have any other questions on some other points that I have, presented today.
Any more questions from anyone? Any questions? I think you have covered, sir. You have covered the entire space, so people doesn't have any question. So I have to. You have covered the total area within a short span of time, and people doesn't have any question. So may I request anyone have any question? So no question. So I have to conclude the session. So first of all, I have to express my sincere thanks to the organizer for giving me an opportunity and special privilege to act as a chair of the session, who happens to be my teacher, one of my respected teacher when I was a student in Jadavpur, and we are acquainted for a long time. Now, what Sir have raised the number of issues related to the focus area, which is the core topic of the India's relation with Sri Lanka and Maldives in recent times. And I have also enriched by myself through different interpretation what Sir have said. But there are a number of things which I have to mention, please, sir, if you allow me. That I think that most of the time India is acting, India's policy was essentially a reactive policy rather than a proactive policy. Suppose I have been beaten by someone, then I am showing my hand to retaliate. So it is sometimes happen. Indian foreign policy makers, they sometimes taking decision after the entire thing was happening. It is, I have seen, this is one thing. And we do not find any leader currently except this Modi and Indira Gandhi, no one in the leader who can take the India in the higher level, what Modi is doing or what Indira Gandhi have done. So that is the thing, we are really lacking the good leadership. And sometimes it has happened that we are really mismatched with China so far as the economic diplomacy is concerned, because China is very much more enriched, and China have a different agenda. They have a privilege of their own structure, the autocratic structure by which they are implementing their own policy, which we can't follow, because in Indian system we have to follow the democratic norms. So that create a lot of problem. Just I'm giving an example that the road connection between the Arunachal, the Manipur and the Myanmar, it's still continuing. The project is not yet finished. Why? Why there is a lacuna? So we have to accelerate the process. The same thing happened. Why the Hambantota, when the Sri Lanka approached India, why we rejected? Why we rejected? Then they approached to China. So this is sometimes we are taking decision when something happened ultimately. And currently, you can see the relation between India and Nepal, what is going on. And China is sometimes interfering too much in their internal matters. And I consider it is a Chinese assertive policy because of its Chinese own BRI project and other programs. So there are our leadership, especially the bureaucrat, the foreign policy makers. That's my most unfortunate. No one will consult you, sir, regarding any policy making. It was the bureaucrat, it was the policy makers who have passed IFS. Now they have joined somewhere and they are taking decision. And they have their own coterie. If we try to function democratically, we have to give the good scholars who know the subject very well. We have to take the cognizance of that scholar, and by which you can implement your policy. That is a major lacuna on our part. Now, with these words, I should not extend my delivery, and I thanks my teacher and the organizer for giving me an opportunity to act as the chairman of this August gathering as well as this August seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborti and Professor Ghoshal, for this excellent and enriching session. With this, we're coming to an end of the conference. I will be passing over the microphone to Dr. Debtusi Misra Chowdhury. Dr. Misra Chowdhury is the Assistant Secretary of Kolkata Society for Asian Studies and Assistant Professor at the Department of Bengali, Sarojini Naidu College for Women, Kolkata. I pass down the microphone to ma'am for the vote of thanks and the concluding remarks.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all. As all good things come to an end in life, so is the webinar. On behalf of KSAS, I take this opportunity to propose vote of thanks to those who have directly and indirectly contributed to this webinar on Indian relations with Sri Lanka and the Maldives, organized by KSAS in collaboration with Indian Council of World Affairs ICWA New Delhi and Indian Council of Social Science Research Eastern Regional Center, Ministry of Education, Shiksha Mantralaya. At the outset, I thank our inaugural speaker, Mr. P. Sahadevan, Professor, Center for South Asian Studies, School of International Studies, JNU. We are really enlightened with your knowledge and presence. We are thankful to our guest of honor, AMB LL Mehrotra, formerly Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India and Coordinator, South Asia, Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, New Delhi, for his valuable speech. I would like to thank Mr. Satyabrata Chakraborti, President of KSAS and General Secretary of Asiatic Society, for his presidential address. A special thanks to the Program Coordinator, Mr. Avirup Saha, Secretary and Joint Convener of KSAS, Dr. Sharmishta Debasu, Convener of this webinar, Dr. Shiuli Mukherjee, for their motivation and enthusiastic support. I may like to express our sincere gratitude to the chairpersons, namely Professor Samir Kumar Das, Department of Political Science, Director, IFPS, University of Calcutta. Chairperson, Mr. P. Sahadevan, MPhil PhD, Professor and Chairperson, Center for Canadian, United States and Latin American Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Chairperson, Dr. Durga Basu, former Professor, Department of Archaeology, University of Calcutta. Chairperson, Mr. N. Satyamurthy, ORF, Chennai. Chairperson, Professor Rahul Tripathi, Department of Political Science, Goa University. And also the valedictory sessions chairperson, Professor Tridib Chakraborti, former Professor, Department of International Relations, JU, Emeritus Professor, School of Liberal Arts and Culture Studies, Adamas University, Barasat, Kolkata. I want to thank them for giving an excellent coverage of their sessions. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for our invitee paper presentations, namely Dr. Samatha Mallempati, Research Fellow, ICWA, Dr. Lopamudra Maitro Bajpai, Visual Anthropologist, Author and International Columnist, Avilash Puljal, Business Management Consultant, former advisor on National Export Strategy to Government of Sri Lanka. Invitee speaker, Dr. Suresh Rangarajan, Professor and Chairman, Department of Political Science, University of Kerala, Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala State. I also want to thank our paper presenters, namely Shaheli Bosch, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, Shet Anandaram Joypuria College, Dr. Dona Ganguly, Assistant Professor, Political Science, the Bhawanipur Education Society College, Dr. Arnab Dasgupta, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, Chandarnagar College, West Bengal, India. I want to thank Soham Dasgupta, MA MPhil in History. I want to thank Ritoja Mukherjee, MA Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University, and currently working as a blogger for an international company, and Ritobash Mukherjee, BA student, Rabindra Bharati University, Department of History. I want to thank Dr. Shreyashi Chowdhury, State-Aided College Teacher, Department of History, Calcutta Girls College, and Dr. Kuntal Narayan Chowdhury, Assistant Professor, Vivekananda College. I want to thank Dr. Shivli Mukherjee, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, Sri Shikshayatan College. I also want to thank Shagota Shorkhel, Faculty, Department of Political Science, Shet Anandaram Joypuria College. Joydeep Narzari, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Boroland University, Kokrajhar. Chiranjeev Shahu, Assistant Professor, Cotton University, Guwahati. I also want to thank Benmol Abraham, Masters of Arts in English with Communication Studies, Christ. Professor Padmini Tolat Balaram, Shilpa Sadhana, Vishwa Bharati. I also want to say that we enriched ourselves so much about Indian relations with Sri Lanka and the Maldives with our speakers' valuable presentations on various perspectives. The panel discussion session became too catchy by the eminent speech of N. Sathya Murthy, Distinguished Fellow and Head Chennai Initiative Observer Research Foundation, Professor Samir Kumar Dash, Department of Political Science, Director IFPS, University of Calcutta, B. M. Jain, former Senior Professor of Pol Science and International Relations at South Asia Studies Center, University of Rajasthan, Jaipur. I also want to say that thank you all for enlightened us. I want to thank valedictory session speaker, Professor Baladas Ghoshal, former professor of Southeast Asia and Southwest Pacific Studies and chairman of the Center for South and Southeast Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. I extend a very hearty vote of thanks to our speakers who spared time from their busy schedule to grace the occasion. I thank all the speakers for gracing your crucial work and sharing with us your opinion and finding this present time. I'd like to thank moderator Dr. Binod Kumar Misra, Director, Center for Studies in International Relations and Development. We are all inspired with all the speaker and paper presenters' great words. We also enjoyed the questionnaire sessions. Thanks to all who spared time with us, think over these topics and shared their opinion. Mr. Chairman and all the listeners, once again I want to state that we are all most grateful to all the speakers on this webinar. We want to thank you all for being with us. It has been a great pleasure. Finally, I want to thank Mr. Tomogno Roy for his kind technical support. Tomogno Roy is state-aided college teacher, Department of Computer Science, Sarojini Naidu College for Women. His kind technical support throughout the webinar makes our webinar a great position. Thank you, Tomogno. And once again, I want to thank everyone. Thank you very much.